The idea here is to give you a flavor of a particular kind of reforms called process reforms. I'll give you examples where I've succeeded. I'll also give you examples where I've not succeeded. But they are still live issues. Merge, close or restructure outdated government agencies. Hundreds of them have outlived their utility or never had some utility to start with. They have to be weeded out. It used to take almost 500 days on average to shut down a company in India. It now takes only 60. Till 2020, if you were working from home, you were actually doing something that was illegal. The subsequent GCC boom that you have seen was partly because of this reform that got done. One of the reasons our economy is growing at the pace it is, despite all the disruptions around us, is because of the systematic effort that we are putting into process reforms. Let me begin by thanking Chanakya University for inviting me here to be here today, sir. So thank you very much, and to the faculty and students and the citizens of Bengaluru for making your way here and waiting patiently for me. So what I'm going to do is speak to you about something that I'm very passionate about, which is process reforms. You all know, and I'm sure you hear us ad nauseum from on TV programs, etc., that India is now, by some margin, the fastest growing economy in the world. We have just gone past Japan, and we expect in the next 18 to 24 months to go past Germany as well. So for an economy that's going reasonably fast in an environment which is very, very tricky, as you all know, the global environment is very, very tricky. The reason we are able to do this is because we are working very hard to make this government, the economy more efficient. And what I'm going to do is to give you a flavor of the kinds of reforms that we are doing to be able to deliver on this, so that we are able to get in the next quarter of a century or two to becoming a Viksit Bharat, a developed India. So the idea here is to give you a flavor of a particular kind of reforms called process reforms. So the question that first arises is, of all the kinds of reforms we do, what on earth are process reforms? So you see, whenever you hear of economic reforms, typically you will hear the word structural reforms. So the impression you will get is that the only kind of reforms you get are these structural reforms. So what are structural reforms? Structural reforms are reforms that change the structure of some activity or of the economy. So the original 1991 reforms, structural reforms. Introducing GST, structural reforms. It's changed the structure of our indirect tax system. Introduction of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, structural reform. It changed the nature of creative destruction in the economy. The inflation targeting framework changed the nature and structure of our monetary policy. So these are structural reforms. These are the reforms that appear on the front page of newspapers. These are the reforms that are usually taught in economics schools and economics courses. So most of you will be actually familiar with what structural reforms are. However, the case that I'm going to make is, in fact, there is another class of reforms that are just as important, called process reforms. These are actually the nuts and bolts reforms. Mostly you'll never hear about them unless you happen to be from that little sector. You'll never hear about them. But in fact, there are literally thousands of these. These are really painful, obscure reforms that people like myself do. There, some law, subsection, rule number 43, subsection D, 3 words have to be changed. And you'll be surprised, as you will see, how many of these reforms need to be done and how many of the reforms we have also done. And then hopefully I'll have convinced you that this is a class of reforms that we as a country, but also at every level of government. So I'm going to talk about, obviously, central government reforms because I work for the Prime Minister. But this needs to be done at the state level. You need to even do it at the municipal level. So these are the reforms that I'm going to talk about. Now the problem is, when I began to look into this whole issue of process reforms, I was surprised that there is almost no literature on this worldwide. So there will be the odd case study of something here and there, but this class of reforms is almost not studied anywhere in the world, not just in India, anywhere in the world. You Google it, you will find very little literature on it, except some stuff I've recently written that's by me. But oddly enough, any of you have actually done an MBA will almost certainly have learned something called business process reengineering. Right? Not an uncommon thing. Anybody doing an MBA probably has to go through this course. However, there is nothing on government process reengineering. You can do, a master's in public administration. This is now a very popular course. You will never be taught government process reengineering. So I had to do something, was to basically go in and steal some of these concepts from the business processing guys and see if I can apply it here. So, to start with the structure of how do you go about doing process reforms, I took this schema. You don't have to memorize it. I will mostly illustrate it later, just to give you an overview. So how do you go about it? The first thing you need to do is, obviously, you need to identify an area where you need a process reform because there's some sort of an inefficiency. The next thing you need to do is to document step by step the as-is process. So how does it function today? And you have to do this fairly meticulously, because the next thing that happens is that very quickly you find out where the blockages in the system are. And now I've done so many of these, maybe hundreds of these process reforms. My learning is that 80 to 90% of the problem comes from 20% of the process. This is known as the Pareto principle. I know this to be true. And why is this important? Because very often to get something going, you don't actually need structural reforms. You just need to clear that 20%. And the rest of the system just functions by itself. So if you do the as-is process, very quickly you identify the exact issues. Then of course you have to do something, to reform that issue. And then you have to do one final step, which is not very often done in governments, which is to monitor the new process, to see if you actually manage to get the outcomes that you were trying to do. And with any large system, not just government, business or anything, the other thing you have to see is, did you have unintended consequences? Sometimes those unintended consequences can be good also, but you need to know what they are. So this is a schema, and you can apply this logic to different kinds of process reforms. So I have identified 7 of them. I am actually working on an 8th, but for now, let's go with the 7. The 7 types of these process reforms are: first, revisit the default lists and precedents of governments. Any large system, it will be even true of large companies, basically function on some default system that it functions on. Nobody knows why on earth it works like that, but it works like that. So first thing and simplest thing to do is to just relook at why on earth does it work like this and not some other way. Does not require a change in law, regulation, nothing. Easiest reform to do. Second type of reform, streamline the existing administrative process. So there is a formal process, you have to streamline it. Third is you have to change regulations within the given law. So when we are functioning the rules and regulations, there is the law that comes from the parliament. Under it there are regulations, so go and look at the regulations. Fourth type, you actually have to change the law. So you have to go to parliament, legislature, etc. Fifth, adding some capacity of government to remove. So although, as you will see, I'm very, very suspicious of bureaucracy, there are times when you need to add capacity. 6, removing a requirement of state mandated activity to remove a bottleneck. And finally, you merge, close, restructure outdated government agencies. Any large system, and the government is no exception, will have large departments, bodies of all kinds that maybe once upon a time had certain usage but no longer do. But nobody bothers to get rid of it. And very often there is a large amount of interest groups that build around that body. So it's not easy to get rid of it. And of course, many bodies are not outdated. They were useless to start with because they were set up to accommodate some retiring bureaucrat, politician, judge. And so right from the beginning it had no use. And that person may have now passed on in life or from the world, but that institution is still there. So all of these need to be relooked at. And I'm going to give you one live example in each one of these. And all of them example I've deliberately given ones that I have worked on because I know more about them. I'll give you examples where I've succeeded. I'll also give you examples where I've not succeeded. But they are still live issues. So let me start with the issue of default lists. So Delhi is full of embassies. And so very often I'm invited to embassy parties. Now one of the interesting things about embassies is that no embassies around the world revise their guest lists. Okay? Every time some new ones are added, but nobody is deleted. So what happens is when you attend these parties, you will suddenly come across somebody who was famous 30 years ago and you assumed had died. And has no relevance to humanity anymore, but they turn up at these embassy parties. They're the only place they get remembered. And this is a problem throughout the government. Okay. So here is something I'm going to tell you about, is the list of national monuments. Okay. So, although I am in the Prime Minister's economics advisory team, for some reason, a few years ago, 2 years ago, he asked me to look at the list of national monuments and to look at whether it was a sensible list or not. So I took up the project and I discovered that India has 3,695 national monuments. So how did we end up with this list? So it turns out that 2/3 of them were inherited from the British government. So they were already national monuments at that time. And almost all of the rest were inherited from the princely states. A very small number have been added in independent India. But basically, this is the list of national monuments we have. But no monument has actually been removed from that list. So that list is full of strange monuments. For example, there are dozens of monuments that have been lost. They're missing. Not recently. There are questions asked in Parliament in the 1970s and 80s where they asked, and the Archaeological Survey of India came back and said that they had no idea where that monument was. So, first of all, I found similarly literally dozens of monuments. I found out where they are. Does the circle officer know that where they are, and so on, and found that many of them were missing. So the Archaeological Survey has no idea where these national monuments are. Then there are hundreds of monuments that are actually colonial era graves. So I'm not talking about, Victoria Memorial or some beautiful building or something. Many of these are just graves of obscure PWD engineer who was killed by a local Naga warrior in Nagaland. The grave is smaller than this stage, but it is a national monument. And all the rules and regulations that apply to the Taj Mahal also apply to it. So for a 200 plus 200 yard distance from this monument, you have to take permission from the Archaeological Survey of India to make any changes to it. And there are many such monuments across the country which simply should not be national monuments. So once you become a national monument, for example in Delhi, there are many such obscure monuments. Nobody knows why they are there. They are small, something or the other. But 300 meters around it is controlled, and you have to basically go and plead with, bribe, and basically get harassed by the local Archaeological Survey official in order to make some small change inside your house. So let me give you one hard example of one of these. So, in 1858, when the British or the East India Company took back Delhi after the Great Revolt, the British Brigadier General who carried out that operation was somebody called John Nicholson. So in 1858, when the city was sacked by the British, John Nicholson carried out the sacking, and he also carried out genocide. He killed a large number of of the rebels and even citizens of the city. In fact, he was considered quite extreme by the standards of his own times. Nevertheless, the British were quite grateful to him for the crushing of the revolt, and so they raised a statue to him outside of Kashmiri Gate, which is, as you know, a very crowded part of Delhi, in Old Delhi. They raised a statue to him. And so when we became independent, this statue was there, and of course the British had classified it as a national monument. So we inherited John Nicholson's statue as a national monument. Of course, we did not delete it from the list. But in 1958, his village in Northern Ireland wrote to the Indian government saying that, look, we presume you no longer have any use for this statue. Why don't you give it to us? So the government of that time in 1958 packed the statue, sent it off to Northern Ireland, where it has been put up in the middle of the village, and I presume they commemorate it every day on his birthday or whatever they do with it. But the interesting part here is that here in India, we did not delete it from our list of national monuments. So it continued to be in the list of national monuments, and that empty spot continued to have all the rules and regulations of a national monument were applied to it. So if you lived in Kashmiri Gate and wanted to make some small change in your house, you had to go and bribe the Archaeological Survey of India fellow to be able to do it. Till, of course, as a part of this project, I discovered it. You'll be pleased to hear that in July of last year, we finally delisted it. However, I have not yet managed to delist his grave, which is not far from Kashmiri Gate. It is still considered a national monument, and you can see there is that board next to it, the blue board, which threatens you dire consequences if you desecrate his grave. But literally there are hundreds of such things, and so anyway, we have managed to now find some 80 such monuments that need to be delisted. We are started the process of that, and also another 80 that need to be re-added to the. So there are major monuments in India, like for example, cave paintings that we have found. There are in Ratnagiri area. There's lots of petroglyphs, etc., which should be in the national monuments, but they are not, and they're just lying around in the air. There is no objection to people building right next to it. So we are going to do this. So this is just one example of the kinds of changes we can make. Type 1. Now I'm going to tell you about type 2. This is about streamlining administrative process, and I'm going to illustrate it with the case of the voluntary liquidation of companies. Has anybody in this room attempted to voluntarily shut down a company? Yeah. Has anybody tried to shut down a company? There are a few here who have. If you have, then you know that it used to take years to shut down a company. Years. And this is not about companies that have gone bankrupt, yeah? This is voluntary. So in most countries, 90% of companies that shut down every year are shut down voluntarily. These are perfectly going concerns, but they shut down because of run-of-the-mill reasons like the old man who runs the company, his kids don't want to run that same company, he wants to shut it down. Or a special purpose vehicle was created for some reason now that purpose has been solved, so they want to shut it down. And there's nobody who's objecting to it shutting down. And yet it used to take years to shut it down. So I looked into this in about 2-3 years ago. And I discovered that there are two ways to shut down companies in India. One is the Section 248 of the Companies Act of 2013. And the second is Section 59 of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The second is used for very large companies, so I'm just going to stick to for the purposes of discussion, to Section 248. So what used to happen is that you had to first go and get a whole bunch of NOCs. As you know, getting NOCs from tax department, labor department is in itself a pain. And for some unknown reason, you had to get it in a particular sequence. One wouldn't give you the thing unless you had got it from the other guy. It's not written anywhere, but that's how it was. Okay. Then, once you had collected all these no objection certificates, you had to take it to the registrar of companies. Now, the registrar of companies, his job was to take this and put up an advertisement in the newspaper, some newspaper. So in case somebody had an objection to shutting it down, they could also could raise the objection. But the problem was that the registrar of companies would sometimes take more than a year to actually put up just the advertisement. And it was a major cause of harassment and rent seeking. You had to basically bribe somebody to put it up. So when I made this presentation 2-3 years ago to the Honorable Finance Minister, who is also the Corporate Affairs Minister, I also showed her the rate card. So with her support, we began to do something about it. In the subsequent year or so, we went through the entire process. The same thing I told you, look at the as-is process. And of course, we identified all the NOCs and all of that. And of course, the fact that this ROC's advertising thing was a major delay point and major harassment and rent-seeking thing. So we have solved that, and as a result of which we created in May of 23 a new system called CPACE. And in CPACE what happens, it's a website-based system. If a company wants to liquidate it, it puts its details up. The system sends it all to all the people who are supposed to give NOCs. If in 21 days those people do not respond, it automatically generates a list. It goes to the ROC. The registrar of company has, if they have an objection, they have to put it up in writing why they object to a company not to be put up in advertisement. Otherwise, it automatically is advertised in the newspaper and you can shut down your company. The result of this is clear. It used to take almost 500 days on average to shut down a company in India. It now takes only 60. 88% reduction in the time for shutting down the company. It's actually now faster than Singapore. This is the similar changes have also happened with the IBC route, but I'm not going to get into it. This is just there for completeness. And I'm now getting into something that Mr. Pai definitely knows about, which is about the need to change regulations under the law. And I'm going to give an example which some of you in Bangalore should be aware of, which is the business of the telecom regulations, which were called the Revised Terms and Conditions Other Service Provider 2008 regulation. Now, if it sounds like some really strange Kafkaesque thing, then you're absolutely right. It was the most Kafkaesque rules you can imagine. So it turns out that till 2020, if you were working from home, you were actually doing something that was illegal. Yeah, because the telecom ministry had regulations which were called the Other Service Providers regulations, which could loosely be applied to pretty much any commercial activity done on a telephone or telecom system, which basically said that any minor change, first of all, you had to get an explicit permission for them for doing any commercial activity on a telecom system. Now, of course, they were clever enough not to apply it to the average guy, but they used to apply it to anybody doing BPO, IT-enabled services, and so on. I'm sure Infosys suffered this quite a lot. And of course, there was no clear definition of OSP. It could be applied pretty much to anybody and anyone going, first of all. Then they had strange and bizarre requirements. So for example, they required you to have an EPA BX machine in every location that you had to do this. Now the younger members of this audience will not even know what an EPA BX machine is. This is a 1980s technology, but till 2020, every location had to have one of these EPA BX machines if you wanted to use telecom lines for commercial use. Then you needed a separate registration for every OSP. So every location had to, so it's not good enough that Infosys has one big, every location had to have it. Technically, if you were working from home, from your bedroom, and walked across to your toilet, I know many of you work from your toilet, don't deny it, you would need a separate registration for it. And then you had restrictions on infrastructure using between domestic and international OSPs. So let me show you how completely bizarre this is. Let us say you are Singapore Airlines, you have got a BPO in India for your ticketing and other requirements. Very common thing. Bangalore is doing a lot of this kind of stuff. And let's say an Indian national in Singapore buys a ticket in Singapore, comes to India, has a problem with his ticket. Then he calls the helpline of Singapore Airlines. Now, how on earth is Singapore Airlines to know whether this is an international call or a domestic call? How do you define it? How does it matter? So this was the kind of nonsense that was there in these regulations that were in play till 2020. And as you can imagine, this was a source of large amount of delays, harassment, not to mention rent-taking. Lots of corruption, hundreds of crores of corruption. Okay. So how did I discover it? You see, when in 2020 March, the lockdown was put, the telecom ministry put out a notification stating that the OSP regulations of 2008 were not applicable till the the lockdown was over in order to enable people to work from home. Now, by now you have realized that I am a suspicious sort of fellow. Moment I read something like this, I realize what is the telecom ministry actually saying? It's basically saying that, we are letting you off for a few months, but even if these rules are absurd, they will still apply at the other side of this. That is what they were trying to say. So I immediately began to study the matter, and I took this matter up all the way to the top. And in November 2020, we made a bunch of changes. So as a result of that, there was now a clear definition of an OSP. It basically applies only to voice BPO services. It's basically, we live in a world of data, so it no longer applies to too many people. Then interconnectivity of infrastructure, EPA, BX, all this work from home, all of these things were basically removed. Now these OSP regulations don't really have any bite. I wasn't able to completely get rid of them, but I basically defanged them. But I had to do it not in one step. So I told you in November 2020, I came up with a bunch of them. But then I discovered that the bureaucrats had inserted certain words here and there, which effectively meant that some of the older ones still applied, under some circumstances at least. So I again went back, and in June 2021, another set of rules were issued, and eventually it was completely put to rest. And look at the impact. So NASSCOM in December 2021, when it did a survey to find out whether or not these OSP telecom regulation reform had an impact, look at what they said. They found that 92% of BPO IT-enabled services had seen a significant decline in their compliance requirements. 28% of them said that it had declined by 50% or more. So the subsequent GCC boom that you have seen was partly because of this reform that got done. Of course, it means that I do not go anywhere near the telecom ministry after dark. Now I'm going to give you the example of a reform that I have tried to do, but so far not succeeded yet. And this relates to something called legal metrology. Now, how many of you even know what legal metrology is? How many know here? Come on, show me. There's a grouping over there, probably lawyers. There's one person here as well. No. But anyway, you seem to know what legal metrology is. For the rest of you, it is the rules, regulations related to weights, measures, and labels. Every country has them. Nothing wrong with having them. It's just that after traffic rules, this is the second most largest source of small-scale bribery in the country. So why does this happen? Does this happen because we shouldn't have these laws. No, every country should have legal metrology rules. The problem is the rules in India are set up in a peculiar way. In that, in your first offense, you'll get a small fine. But in the second offense, you can be sent to jail for as much as 7 years. Okay, so look at what happens. I have data till 21-22, sorry. And you can see that in the first offense, there are as many as 1 lakh cases a year. Okay. But the number of cases in the second instance is 5, 3, 11. So the Consumer Affairs Ministry used to present this data earlier, claiming that look how wonderful our laws are. If you have done mistake once, nobody dares to do a mistake a second time. But you all know what used to happen. Basically, on the first instance, they'll catch you on some small, label, your label has the wrong font or some such kind of error. You'll be asked to pay some 2,000 rupees as fine. But once you have paid it, you are their slave for life. Because the second time they catch you, you can go to jail for 7 years. So naturally, from there on, and this is cumulative, so every year you add those many to the list of people who you can go and extract rent from. So this is what was going on. Now I found this data in 2022, and after that you will see that they have stopped issuing these data. So I fought, and in the Jan Vishwas Bill of 2022, we said that we will make it more difficult to send people to jail and decriminalize some of these things. So I thought I had won the battle. So when the law actually got done, I discovered that sections 30, 33 and 36 had been quietly left out. It turns out that 80% of the cases happened in that. I have not yet left this battle. So there is a Jan Vishwas 2 bill also. And if necessary, maybe there'll be a 3. And I am pushing that these, you can't fully decriminalize them to be fair, because you need certain situations, you do need, somebody does real cheating repeatedly, you may need to send that person to jail. But you can't have this, make it this easy to send people to jail and threaten them. So I have argued for making a few more layers, at least 3 layers for criminal proceedings to be introduced. Let's see, maybe I'll succeed, maybe I won't, we'll see. Now I'm going to talk about the type 5. Now for all my suspicion of bureaucracy, there are some times when you actually have to add layer of more people into the process. And I'm going to give you the example here of the intellectual property rights, and specifically about the patent office. Now, we want to be Vishwaguru, we want to be a knowledge power. Now obviously that means that we should be able to do more patents, should be an aspiration. But let me show you how things used to be 10 years ago. 10 years ago, that's 2015, China had a filings of 11 lakhs, of which it used to grant about 3.5 lakhs of patents. US, you did about little less than 6 lakh patent filings, granted about 3 lakh patents. We used to do 47,000 patent filings only. But even worse, we used to only grant 6,000 patents. The whole system was unbelievably inefficient. So sometimes it would take you 8 to 10 years to hear back from the system. Now, this is technology. By the time you may get, even if you get your patent, the technology has moved on and the patent is completely useless. So not surprisingly, people in India did not patent. In fact, many would go abroad and patent in Singapore or US or some such place. Now 10 years have passed. In that time, the amount of filings in China, as you can see, has gone up even further. They now get 16 lakh patent filings, and they give out some almost, they give out 9 lakh patents a year. Now, this is a bit of an exaggeration because they have something called utility patents, and many of their patents are actually very poor quality. Even if you strip it out, they are still giving out 3 lakh decent patents, okay? So, doing pretty well. The US, their filings have not gone up very much, as you can see, and their grants have also gone up only marginally, but still they also give out about 3 lakh patents a year. But interestingly, if you look at 2023, our filings meanwhile have doubled to 92,000. Now it's gone over 1 lakh. But you can see the grants in the year 2023 was 1 full lakh. Dramatic increase. I'm going to come to explain 24 a little. Look at 23 number. 1 lakh patents a year. Still much less than what China and US are doing, but in the same ballpark. Yeah. Dramatically, from 6,000 grants to 1 lakh grants. Now, what is interesting here is that we are not getting now enough patent applications. So you look at what has happened for the data for 24. I don't have it. China, US have not given the data, but I know the data for India because I have access to it. We get only 1 lakh patents a year. We have cleared the backlog in 23. We can only give about, not just because you file doesn't mean you get a grant, right? If you have some sort of a system, maybe about 40% will get a grant, and that also after a lag. So in fact, I actually have a capacity to deal with about 1 lakh filings, or more than 1 lakh of filings, but we are not getting enough filings now. And let me show you why we have been able to get to this position. It's simply manpower. So China has about 13,700 people in its patent office. This is 2023 data. They may have more now. US has 8,000 people in its patent office. But look at the number of patent office people we had in 2015. 271. How on earth do you expect them, even if they were very efficient, all the AI in the world you use, do what you want, they cannot compete. So since then we can see we have systematically increased the numbers. And in 24-25, we have added more people. So we now have 1,383 people. I have already approvals in place for hiring another 500 people. So I will cross 2,000 people. I will reach about 2,000 people. This will give us, in about 18 months' time, the ability to handle 250,000 applications a year, which is equivalent to about a little over 1 lakh of grants a year. That is the capability I will have. So those of you who are innovators, let me tell you, for once the government has created the capacity and we are waiting for you. Now it's the R&D guys who nearly need to get on with it. Don't blame the patent system. Now I'm getting into the business of removing a state mandated activity. Okay? So many things happen within government, but very often the state mandates certain activities. It's not necessarily inside the government, but you have to do it. So I'm going to give here the example of something called mediation. How many of you know what mediation is? Quite a few people. So mediation, as the word suggests, is basically a pre-litigation process by which basically two parties who have some dispute with each other, rather than turning up in court, they try to mediate and try to settle it before they go to court. I have no problem with mediation. I am actually a votary of mediation. However, for some reason, Section 12A of the Commercial Courts Act of 2015 makes it mandatory for all commercial disputes to be mediated. Now, it may sound like a very sensible thing to do, but it is not. Because, as I have shown you data that I have collected from 2 commercial courts in Mumbai, it's a commercial capital, so the biggest commercial courts in the country. What I've discovered that 98% of those mediations are failures. But you are mandated to go to it before you go to the courts. So effectively for 98%, what is happening is that you are adding 6 months to the process, paying lawyers, paying the mediator, and essentially wasting your time. So a process that is already inefficient gets 6 months added to it. Now, of course, when I began to point this out that we should make this voluntary, a lot of lawyers got very angry with me. But this is a major part of the problem of India. Everybody wants other parts of the system to become more efficient except their little patch. And this is not only true within the government, it's also true throughout the system. Everybody here wants their little patch to be protected and everybody else to be reformed. So I'm now pushing for this to be done, to have the Commercial Courts Act to be revised, and for this particular mandate to be removed. As I said, I'm all in favor of voluntary mediation, but making it compulsory basically means that you'll effectively have the same thing that happens when you basically protect something. Just like protecting car industry gave us ambassador cars, the same quality of service you'll get from the lawyers in the mediation courts. Not surprising that you get that bad outcome. Now I come to the last category, which is merge, close or restructure outdated government agencies. Now any large system will have outdated government agencies, right? Not just governments. And of course, something as large as a central government will literally have hundreds, at last count about 800 autonomous agencies of central government. And then state governments. Think about the large numbers of bodies that are there. As I told you, some of these bodies may have had some use, some of them may still have some use, but many of them, hundreds of them, have outlived their utility or never had some utility to start with. They have to be weeded out. And notice here the similarity with what DOJ was doing. DOJ, of course, has done this for the last few months in a very big way and a very visible way. But just so that you know that here in India, we have been doing this for some years, and we have weeded out lots of departments already. I'll give you some examples. Tariff Commission, All India Handloom Board, All India Handicraft Board, Central Organization of Modernization of Workshops, that's in the railway, Rashtriya Mahila Kosh, Director of Film Festival, National Film Archives of India, Children's Film Society. Some have been closed, some have been merged, some have been restructured. Now, whenever you try to shut some of these things down, inevitably this thing has already collected a interest group wants to perpetuate it. Now, how do you find these people, first of all? Well, for this purpose, please look, when you hear annual budget, please look in the expenditure budget. Nobody looks at it. It's a thick document. Go into the ministries and you'll be shocked with the large numbers of bodies that each ministry has. In fact, very often, the people who head those ministries do not know about some of the organizations within it. It's not possible because there's so many obscure agencies. And since nobody can keep track of them, every year they get that 10% or whatever increase. So over time, they've got crores of rupees, land, everything. But nobody knows what these bodies do. So again, 5-6 years ago, I began to look into this. I discovered large numbers of them, and as I said, we have managed to shut some of them down. So let me give you an example of what happens when you try to shut one of them down. So there was this All India Handicraft Board. The point is, when you shut something down, you'll always be told that, this activity is very important. That trying to shut it down is, this government is fascist. You don't care about handicrafts and artisans and so on. No, that is not the point. There are actually many bodies helping artisans. There's the Khadi Udyog, there is cottage industries, there is Silk Board here, which is wonderful for your traffic. The question is, does All India Handicraft Board do something or not? So when in 2022 we shut it down, there was a lady who had been heading it for 20 years. She got very annoyed and she wrote a nasty op-ed stating that this government is fascist, it does not love artisans and so on. So Smriti Irani ji, who was then the Minister of Textiles under whom all this came, she simply tweeted in reply to this article and stated the following, that Madam, if you can get us the minutes of any meeting you have held under your leadership in the last 16 years, we are happy to re-establish it. We are still waiting. And there are myriad of these. There are all kinds of strange bodies in the government, like this, by the way, there is a UPSC service called the National Indian Salt Service. It still exists. So you'll be shocked by the kind of things that are there. And it's tough to, you have to really push at every stage to shut them down. And I'll give you another example, Tariff Commission. So, all of you know that before we became a liberalized economy, there used to be a body called the Bureau of Industrial Cost and Pricing. Yeah? Very powerful body. This used to set the prices of various grades of steel, cement, all these kinds of things. Many of you know about it. Then 1991 happened. Overnight, this body, which had lots of powers, very senior secretary level person running it, etc., overnight it became irrelevant. At its peak, it had 350 people working in it. It was a serious body. Overnight, it became irrelevant. But for some reason, nobody remembered to shut it down. So it existed for several more years. Then it decided that hanging around, being still called BICP, there was a danger that somebody would notice them. So they quietly changed their name to Tariff Commission. Except that they had nothing to do with setting tariffs. It's in the wrong place. See, tariffs are set between Commerce Ministry and Finance. This body sits in DPIIT. It is not even a part of the tariff setting process. And yet it continued to exist for 3 decades after we became a liberalized economy. Some very well-known senior economists also headed the body, but it continued to exist. So I discovered it again in 2021. And so I raised the issue of shutting it down. So there was the person who was heading it, she got very annoyed with me. She was also a neighbor, by the way. She complained to me, to the cabinet secretary, who then had to hold a meeting, and this is during COVID, so we had to hold a meeting online. And we called, so since there was a tariff commission and she was making the case that she was a very useful body, both the representative of the Central Board of Indirect Taxes and Customs and a representative of Commerce were called, the secretary or somebody was called to the meeting. So the cabinet secretary asked them, have you ever used any input from the Tariff Commission to set tariffs? And they both said that they had never heard of it. So that was the end of Tariff Commission. In 2022, it was wound up. At this stage, it had about 80 people still working there. Many people had joined and retired from that body over the course of 30 years without ever have done anything useful. They were occupying 2 floors in that building behind Khan Market. There's an ugly grey building behind Khan Market. They used to occupy two floors there. So now that has been emptied out. I don't know what it's used for anymore. But the funny thing here is, nobody lost their job. This is government. They were reallocated to some other part of the government where hopefully they are doing something useful. So I actually cannot understand why people were objecting to shutting it down also. But somehow there is this thing that you have this small little empire and you must defend it. So I have discovered many more dozens of such bodies which I am slowly one by one attempting to shut it down. In fact, I am now running a big program inside the ESCPM to map the government. So in the next few months, I will be mapping or trying to map out the government, and we'll then hope to discover many such bodies in the government that we can literally shut down. So I've given you some examples of 7 types of these. There's an 8th that I have thought of, but I haven't put it together in the slide form. So hopefully in the next iteration you'll see it. But the basic point is, I hope I have been able to convince you that process reforms are important. This is really the plumbing of the economy, of the government, and you have to go out there and clean it. It's very painful work. It is thankless work. Nobody knows about what you're doing. the people who were beneficiaries of the older system, from whom you have taken away the candy, generally hate you. Those who benefit from it come later on because they are new entrants. They have no idea you did this. So this is really thankless job, but you have to do it. And we are literally doing hundreds of such reforms. One of the reasons our economy is growing at the pace it is, despite all the disruptions around us, is because of the systematic effort that we are putting into process reforms. And let me say that it would not be possible without the support and blessings of the top political leadership. After all, I'm not doing this. Nobody in the government will listen to me because I'm Sanjeev Sanyal. They listen to me because I have the backing of the political leadership. And to be fair, for all the mocking I've done today of the bureaucracy, there are parts of the bureaucracy that really want to get this done. Many of the reforms could not have been possible without their backing. In fact, many of these things, the actual changes that I got done were their ideas. So I have managed to do many of them because of there are officers there. Very often they don't want to be named, in fact. They are today at junior levels where they may get picked on later on for having been part of this process. But there are very, very good officers in the bureaucracy who very often tell me what to do, whereas it is against their personal interest to do so, because they care for this country. So let me end this by saying that this process is ongoing, and in the recent budget a few months ago, the Honorable Finance Minister announced that we are going to have a deregulation commission. So hopefully that will systematize this into an institutionalized way of going about doing process reforms. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.